Thank you. I'll call Deputy Colm Keaveney.
Thank you, Lascan Corla. I'm sure you will join me and on behalf of our constituency of East Galway. There's a lot of political play made in this chamber about the necessity for an apology to the survivors. On behalf of the people of Galway East, I'd like to say sorry to those survivors. And I hope that you hear that loud and clear from this chamber. I understand also how difficult it is for the government, for many reasons, not to get to their feet today and say sorry. It's their advice. But for whatever little instalment that you can take from, and sense that you can take from that acknowledgement, I hope it goes some way to address your circumstances. Lascan Corla, I broadly welcome the terms of reference of the Commission, but I share concerns, and those concerns have been outlined by the colleagues here today in the chamber, and I would ask the Minister here today to positively consider taking on board the observations that are being made by all of the deputies in the chamber over the course of this debate. The terms of reference, as I can establish, demonstrate some flexibility, and my concern with respect to that is that in the past, previous inquiries or tribunals have found themselves in the courts with respect to challenges on that same type of flexibility. And I have a concern around that, Minister. So I think it would be better if you would positively consider opening up the terms of reference for amendment, as has been proposed by other deputies in the House today. And if that was the case, then we could include 3 holding centres, the Temple Hill, the Stemronan, the nurseries in Fermoy, the West Bank, Avoca, Braemar House, St Philomena's and St Gerard's, St Rita's Nursing Home, and the second Regina Hostel, the sister hostel in which Dublin was to be included. Now, if we were to amend the terms of reference, we could expand this to incorporate a more inclusive, catch more information, and to seek as much justice as possible for those people who have been injured by the past. The method of taking representative samples, Minister, from county homes, on face value, it's reasonable, but for survivor groups, they have requested to their Oireachtas members that a greater sample should include any home of any survivor who presents themselves to the Commission. And I think at the outset, if we are to exclude any survivor because we have segregated homes and said that one home would take precedent over another, is genuinely unfair for those people who seek to have questions answered. So I don't believe it's unreasonable that we would request to have a provision of some partial measure to include survivors of the circumstances that are not provided for within the appendices. And given the large body of records and research that has already been gathered by the government, particularly with the Magdalen laundries, it is inexplicable, Minister, that we would turn our face against these people. And even at this late stage, I would ask you to consider incorporating and including that data. Cancorla, the treatment of women and children in these institutions and in society at large is a dark chapter in our history. And we need to face up to that, to be honest, and we need to complete this process in the interest of justice for everybody involved. We also need to ensure that we particularly tribute those people by having an open, transparent and inclusive process. In their mortality rates, Lascan Corla, their forced adoptions, their forced labour, the mechanisms of shame that have been imposed on those people, they are largely required to have the most inclusive process to make sure that this Commission is worthy of the justice that's required. Society shaming women, shaming children, placing them in these homes, it ensured that dark events of our past, the unsayable, was kept unknown. Mothers, mother and baby homes, must be seen in a broader context. And that context has to be with respect to the scale of institutions that existed in this country in our past, whether they were mother and baby homes, industrial schools, Magdalen laundries, mental health facilities. And it has been said in this House that in our history, We managed to lock up more Irish people as a proportion per head of population than the Soviets locked up in the Soviet Union. And we now know that society, the church, the state and church combined, managed to shame women and children and has sought to separate these vulnerable people in a so-called attempt to have a respectable society, to punish them for actions that were not crimes under laws, but rather they were being punished for violating a harsh civil social code. So, Minister, I think it's important that we face up to our past and state in unambiguous terms that these survivors of these homes have no cause for any shame. And the rest of society, I would invite here today to open up their arms and to ensure that they can be a part of the acknowledgement of the dedication and the commitment and the action for justice for those survivors. We know that the church, we know that the state combined, colluded together, they engaged in forced adoptions. Aspects of that continued to echo in the recent past with respect to certain bodies refusing to permit those who are affected to have access to their own personal information. And as Concordia, that long history of forced adoption in this country needs to be faced up to. And we also need to amend the law with respect to that. And worse still, those not adopted, they were sent out into slavery, onto farms, into businesses, owned by so-called respectable persons in society. I personally met those people. I know them. And I ask you, Minister, to include those people. Let them make their allegations about the practice of child labour and the abuse that took place in rural Ireland with respect to farming out slavery children to the well-off in society. I've also met others who've been farmed out to the most infamous industrial schools, who endured physical, mental, and sexual torture. We also know about the vaccines, the clinical drug trials carried out with children in the care of the state, run, subcontracted out to the church. And this information is not new, Minister, and we've known about it for a decade. The extent of the practice, the questions that we have around this, we cannot be complacent about securing truth, fact, and justice with respect to the potential of the Commission in this regard. Minister, this story began in Tuam, and many of the specifics of what happened there are probably in common with every other mother and baby home in this country. In Tuam, we know that 800 children died in a mother and child home, enduring a mortality rate that was far higher from the prevailing national mortality rates in this country. We know that their deaths were recorded, but not the circumstances of their burial. We know that some, if not all of the bodies were buried in an unmarked grave near the home. And we know that skeletal remains rest within a tank or a septic tank or some location which lies inside the location of a local authority estate in the Dublin Road in Tuam. Minister, it's the high mortality rate, the burial practices. Tuam is probably not unusual with respect to other homes when we make those comparisons. And I hope that the Commission will examine the circumstances of the burial of those deceased children. There's a need, unfulfilled since this story broke, for the state to take an active part with respect to managing that gravesite. This matter is causing considerable discredit to many families in that area. And I've been contacted by some of them, particularly who have been distressed by the accumulation of speculation and rumour about burial sites in that area. And we need to establish fact. We need to get into that location, Minister, and identify and clarify what is the nature of that burial site, what is the nature of that tank. Minister, it should be noted that if there's only one body discovered, it still leaves us with 800 missing bodies in Tuam. Even if we find all 796 children buried in a neat row with obvious care, it still leaves us with a mortality rate that's far higher than the national norms, and the site in Tuam should be properly secured. Records connected with Tuam and all of those locations, any other home in this country, need to be secured as a matter of urgency. The mention of malnutrition being listed as a cause of death is particularly worrying to me. as does the exact function of the dying room. That's Concordla. Who was monitoring what was happening in these homes?
Thank you, Deputy.
Who, in the context of the role of the state, this state outsourced and privatised the care of the most vulnerable people in the history of the state, and who, with respect to the people in this House, were responsible to make sure that we had accountability and transparency for the most vulnerable people in our history.